And I thought we'd start with kind of a picture of how our marketing plans usually look. We start out super excited, super optimistic, and a lot of times we end up looking like Tommy Boy. So what I thought today we could do was take the information that the guys are going to share in here, both Eric and Brian, and really talk about what we can do with the markets that we have today. Now, the Pro Farmer Tour just ended recently, and it came out with their call as a 168.1 bushel per acre versus 175 that the government has. So they're calling it good, not great. Now, Indiana's coming in at 177 versus 189 USDA. Ohio at 175 versus 190 on USDA. And we won't even talk about Kentucky and Tennessee, who've been under extreme pressure this year. So the 22 crop appears to be trending lower. So which could mean higher prices, right? So recently I was at the Corteva headquarters. I got to hear the world famous economist, Dr. Steve Elmore, and he has a great following and very knowledgeable on ag economics. And I love the saying that he uses: as unknowns become known, then we get to know more about what the crop is happening. So the unknowns, wars, COVID, all this thing happening, supply chain interruption, as those get solved, it boils down to supply and demand economics. And it looks like in 22 we can have higher prices, which is a great thing right here at harvest. But he also is calling for lower prices for 23 and 24. He's citing the fact that we have the biggest bean crop ever coming off with the harvest of South America, capping that off, the second biggest corn crop ever. So his belief is prices will be declining after this year for 23, 24. And then he believes that input prices will decline, but much slower and lagging as opposed to the grain prices. So what happens to the farmer? Margins get squeezed. And that's the important thing on the farm, is what is your margin? What's left over? Not necessarily the selling price, but what do you get to keep? And we're very worried about that for 23, 24. So today, the experts on this call, Brian Wiggins and Eric Johnson, are going to help you think about how to respond to this kind of scenario, a different scenario than we've had for the last couple of years, where we have really good prices now and looking at potentially lower prices and margins being squeezed. So let me turn this over to Brian. Take it away, Brian. Teach us.
We'll try, Steve, and thank you. So, really big thank you to Farm Credit Mid-America for inviting me today. Just really love those opportunities to engage with all of you and be able to talk about returns and maybe a lot of fun going on with prices and but yet a lot of stress, and those stresses change with different price levels. You have low prices cause one type of stress and high prices cause another. So I get to work with our crop risk specialist team in ADM, and so we get to do a lot of work in this space, and I hope we'll get to share maybe some different thought processes or maybe ways to potentially approach this market this year. So I want to start off by this. This picture really helps me think about maybe how we approach different sections of our business in the farming atmosphere. And you can think of it almost in any manufacturing sector, whether it be producing cars or any sort of widget. It is the investment or the asset, right? And what drives that, and what's the time frame on that, the 10, the 20, the 30, whatever legacy that is on the investment, and the things that apply to that. And they're all interconnected, right? So that land investment, the stewardship, the tiling, the irrigation, the practices that are used, maybe the proximity that it is to, whether it be infrastructure, so the demand points, all those things become a long-term type of investment. And we have to make those decisions, and we well know that. But what we're going to focus in on today are those inputs and outputs. And maybe some of those, again, are adjacent to the land investment. But ultimately, these are the 1 to 3 year controllables, how we approach that and how we manage that. Maybe some of the investment that I do applies back to the land, but it also applies to maybe the cost or the rate or the efficiency of the input. and ultimately the effectiveness of the output. And I want to really hone in on how do we control, or how do we manage, maybe how do we think differently about how we approach those input and output scenarios, because we spend so much time honed in on the price, right? Or maximizing the yield. But ultimately, like Steve said, the margin between the two becomes extremely important. We think about the variables that are controllable. So fertilizer, fuel, because things like labor, uh, my time spent in management, I used to think of it as a variable, and in fact, in accounting, it is considered a variable. However, if I have a hired labor, I'm probably paying that person, and then the overtime becomes something. Seed, yeah, maybe I can save 10, $20 here or there, but ultimately the controllables are the dynamic parts of the business, things like fertilizer, which are more of a commodity, and the output, which is a commodity also. So let's just drill into that a little bit. This has been very helpful. I heard this spoken about, I think, within the past couple of years, and pardon the drawing, because don't make fun of my drawing. I'm an artist. I am not. I'm going to keep my day job. But it's a cycle, or commodity return cycles. Where are you in a cycle? So let's just go left, right, and think about this. Margin stability. This is where we go through those multiple years where no one is making money, or at least that's what we're saying. The margins are thin. We're in a commodity environment where we try to out yield the problems. And it's fairly compressed margins, but it's still somewhat stable. You think about the price of corn, and we talk about the magical number of 4 and 10, right? So think about those time periods, and actually you have to dial back today a couple of years to talk about that, to rapid margin expansion. This started actually in about September of 2020 for us. This rapid margin expansion where price of the output outpaces the input. And you can look back actually on charts, or think about those times when that happened, that rapid margin expansion to margin compression, where maybe those inputs have caught up, prices have stabilized to start to drift, and ultimately margin inversion, which Steve was talking about, where you think of the producer or the farmer or whatever type of commodity driven market or manufacturing business sees those margins, those high prices, and they continue to try to outpace or out yield the input, and ultimately leads to margin inversion, and ultimately just margin overall destruction. I think in general, we're somewhere on the back end of the margin expansion, in the margin compression phase. And if you look at the cost of your inputs today, and we've been talking about it, and prices coming off the highs, that is a signal of margin compression. Now, we can enter back into the margin expansion phase. However, ultimately on a cycle, we're in the margin compression type of period. It's a market in transition where we will continue to try and press the crop. We're in a world dynamic that in general is inflationary. It is costing more to do business. And ultimately, if you think about your own family or your own business, you're making decisions on how you purchase based upon your income versus the cost of those inputs, whether it be feeding your family. Are you making less trips? Are you buying different types of food? Are you changing any habits? Those things are happening around the world. I like to talk about this also because it goes into this idea um, of what is controllable, and that's this principle of adjacency, or at least in this business. And we see farming in the center, but we see all the downstream issues. We see the upstream issues, and all the things that are going on that all feed into this idea of farming that are impacting one another. And we focus on a price type scenario for our output and also our inputs, right? But ultimately, there's these mega trends and mega things that are happening that even if you read information sources, let's say on inputs, they will bring up potentially different portions of these over time. And the further away you get from farming, the more macro or big picture it tends to be. So I say, okay, at home or food service type dining. Well, that's a trickle effect on what are people eating from a protein source, what type of oil is being used. Just think of those macro trends versus the micro trends. How much cattle is on feed? What is ethanol type usage? So whenever I think a big picture about that margin compression and margin inversion, where are those things on the end of the spectrum going? So whenever I look at those type of things, what is happening on world demand? What is happening on the farm sector? Are we trying to push the crop? Obviously, we have weather that affects us year to year, but ultimately, what is the larger trend? And I'll tell a quick story. And emotions, I say, work in two different ways. For us as a manufacturer, it talks. You think about the sticker shock on the input and the output price bias, because we always think that the input is worth less and the output is worth more. And my story is, I'm not actively farming. The family, takes care of that back in Kentucky, but ultimately I take care of some pasture here for a club that my daughters are in. And if you want to make fun, that's fine. We show llamas, not your normal story. But I wanted to put on some late season urea, and so I showed up at the retailer, and just I knew I was going to be a price taker. In fact, it's only 10 acres, so I'm looking at maybe 1,100 pounds of urea to go down. And they priced me at what was it, $1,010 a ton. And of course, I'm a little bit taken aback. Maybe not from the total dollar amount with being 10 acres, but on a cost per unit basis, it's a major sticker shock. And think about the scale of your operation. What I'm thinking about that, it just adds up to maybe the most dollars most of you have experienced in many years, and certainly at least in several years, sometimes in a lifetime. But yet we may be thinking directionally about this Pro Farmer Tour coming in a lower yield than what the USDA is, and that gives us or maybe feeds into our bias to believe that the output is worth more. But again, pay attention to the macro trends. That it does not mean we don't have somewhat of a seasonal type of rally or anti-seasonal rally, counter-seasonal rally. However, what is the ultimate trend in things over time? Will we continue to produce the crop, and will it outpace the demand in the world? To hone in on this idea of wiring the brain, about how can I mitigate my thought processes around where my emotions are versus what my expectation or the true dynamic in the market is. And I just have four main points in wiring the brain, maybe thinking just a little bit differently. And some of you may already be doing these things, but are there things that I can share or work out to complement the resources of another? Okay, so I've seen those scenarios, and y'all have too. Do I share equipment? Does someone else harvest my grain? Well, in this case, does someone own their own fertilizer spreader? Um, Someone's own spray equipment? Can I work out and negotiate options to complement others' resources so that I manage my internal capital? I manage those resources and maybe give me a way that I can better control or manage the efficiency or effectiveness or cost of those inputs. Also, dual use. And we get into this a lot with ADM fertilizer, which is that bulk wholesale direct to the farm sale, that we talk about dual use. So are there things that we can do for space? And I'm not telling you how to do these things. It may just be opportunities to examine and think about how you're approaching your farm. Every farm on here is different on what your capacity, your scale, or effectiveness, cash available, all those sort of things. But just a brief story, like in soybean oil, at soybean processing plants, we have many plants that can use some of their tanks for storing soybeans when it's necessary, or maybe storing soybean oil whenever it's more beneficial to do that. Think of hoop buildings. Is there possibility for equipment storage, or maybe short-term fertilizer storage, or concrete pads, tanks for different liquid opportunities? Can I use different tanks for that? And also, ultimately, are there better places to put cash from an investment standpoint? We so often get caught wanting to prepay or store cash in that way to roll forward income, but maybe is it better or to think about ways in that long-term strategy that we were talking about that we have investments that are made that will bring down or better manage that effectiveness or efficiency on it. Like I say, maybe fertilizer spreaders, those sort of things, or storage of some type that allows us to better manage those inputs. Ultimately, are we seeking out better ways to prepare ourselves to make more informed decisions for the biggest variables on the farm? And I'm not pointing any fingers, but how much time do we spend on seed? We spend a lot of time on seed, for example. It's very important. That impacts the top line of the business. Are we spending an equal amount of time on the variable inputs and the variable outputs about how we manage the controllables on each one of those from a cost standpoint? So information, wholesale purchasing, efficiency, effectiveness on the farm. Ultimately, I want to look at variables can be controlled in individual legs or combination. Because right now, many of us, what we'll do is we'll make sales in stages to optimize the price output, and then we will look and be price takers on the inputs. And ultimately, that's fine, but we have different ways we potentially are able to control that. I like to value the input as a value of the output. It's a whole lot of values, okay? But what I mean by that is how many bushels or what price at different levels does it take across years and as a bias to manage the value of the input? And I tend to do it in bushels. How many bushels, for example, of corn will it take to cover the value of nitrogen this year? And then what is my bias on the nitrogen price and then the output price, the price of corn in this example? How many bushels does it take today versus history? Can I go back and look at that? I know how much I spent for the retailer for input prices last year. Can I break that down? And then what type of price did I receive? What is the price today versus what it was then? Because it allows me to set expectation. And ultimately, we're in a high volatility environment. And you hear these terms all the time in crop insurance. We hear it in price levels and in information whenever we read commentary. But ultimately, what does high volatility mean? High volatility is very simple at this. Obviously, there are many formulas that go back. It's a look back to say implied. This is a range that that the market can move in. You can hear volatilities like a 20 volatility, a 22, a 25, maybe less, maybe more. But ultimately, we're in a high volatility environment. This means that there is a high potential range of outcomes. That is what it means. So if I have low volatility, the market is implying that there is a low potential range of outcomes. We're currently in the high one, so there's a high possible range of outcomes. This is in fertilizer and in grain right now, that potential high range of outcomes. So it can move large directions one way or the other. Ultimately, there's multiple ways that I know Eric's going to speak to you about one in particular that I like to look at. I look at an offense and defense, and let's just think about sports. Whenever I'm playing sports, ultimately we can win some games with a really good offense. We can win some games with really good defense, but the most consistent, most effective teams that we've had have a good offense in combination with a good defense, a solid plan that leads to better outcomes. So there may be margin protection insurance, which I know Eric's going to talk about. That's managing the input and the output from an insurance. Is playing a good defense. There are options to defend more bushels and defend more price. The same thing happens in the cash world that I live in. Are there ways to play better defense on buying my inputs or play better defense offense on the prices that I get? Excuse me. So I want to try this concept really quick just to demonstrate what I mean by valuing the input as a value of the output. So I want to dial back to early September of 2020. Looking at December of 21, right? Because whenever I'm looking to buy nitrogen now for my farm for row crops, I am looking at that December 21 reference. All the time we'll want to look at the current prices, but in the current environment, it may be wise to look at 21. And we're looking at a little over $6 corn, for example, for next year's corn. But back in 2020, before this real rally started, we were sitting with just under, but I'm going to round it off, just under $200 28 UAN. I'm just using a 200 pounds actual nitrogen applied, and we were right at that upper $3 or $4 mark for December 21 corn. It's equivalent to 71.42 an acre for that N application for UAN 28. At that level, that's 17.8 bushels to cover nitrogen. There's that margin stability. That is the period we were in. Today, for December 23, we're sitting with $400 plus, maybe 425, 450. It's been up here the past few days with some of the nitrogen issues or natural gas issues in Europe. I'm using the same formula, 200 pounds of actual N applied on UAN 28, and I'm using $6 corn for 2023. And very simply, where are we at? We're at double the cost of nitrogen on that input. And when I look at the value of the input versus the output, I'm at 23.8 bushels to cover that, not quite double, right? Because of that higher price. But whenever I'm setting expectations and I value that, I can look and see maybe where to dial in my expectations. Maybe I can look at more points across history about what it takes whenever I'm establishing my budget. But if I left UAN at $400, then the equivalent is $8 corn, right? Or at $6, it's $300 UAN. So maybe that allows me to dial in my expectations of either managing the individual legs, maybe selling some corn and not buying my input. But definitely if I buy my input, what am I saying? At this point, I'm saying to cover that nitrogen needs, I need the price to go higher. But if I value them together, maybe I can start to manage and say, you know what, with nitrogen being one of the largest equivalent impacts to my bottom line, can I sell some of the grain and manage some of the input and buy some of the input right now for pre-fill or forward pay? So what levers can I pull to mitigate those risks? Just want to drill in a little bit to current price expectations. So we've seen some recent rallies, particularly in corn. We saw some of the rally in beans. Beans are a little bit different story right now, especially with two hemispheres, potentially larger crops in South America, those sort of things coming on, being seeded this fall. But real rallies are typically hard approaching harvest. And by what I mean by a real rally is an approach back towards the high, which is $7 plus. Currently, we're sitting right in that 674, 670 type area on December 22 corn, and the tendency will be for December 23 to follow that as well. And a lot of these recent rallies have been in dryness, in the United States and across the world. It is not based upon that demand picture. Remember, the world demand picture is more inflationary. It is more interest rate hiking. It is more discretionary in the type of food that we eat. And on a macro level, is trending lower. So ultimately, this market is probably looking at a lower 170 type crop, still closer to the USDA than what the pro farmer is. Just remember, those real rallies are hard approaching harvest. Now, the tightness in the world may keep us supported or should keep us supported. That 560 December 22 low is probably a good price from the low side. I don't think the market wants to sell below that. It does not mean that it can't. And this 1450 area on beans is typically a follower of corn right now. Ultimately, this natural gas situation in Europe is probably the impact on nitrogen, with us sitting well over $400 whenever you can get a price on UAN, for example. We need Europe in order to balance the balance sheet in the world on nitrogen. And right now, with the natural gas situation in Europe and the price situation, ultimately, my tendency is to believe that the risk is on the higher side than significantly falling on the input side lower, closer to that $300 mark that I was talking about. I think we're looking at a potential rally higher than a drop lower. Briefly, I just want to share some things that you can access. I talked about information. Obviously, no pressure here. This is I work in a crop row specials team. We want to enhance the value in the access to information that you and Farm Credit customers have. You can search on the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store for Adium Fertilizer. They'll approve that access. You can get quick request quotes. You can get an invitation to monthly conference calls. It's also available monthly on our adiumadvantage.com website under fertilizer. Notifications on big market changes. So I want you to know that that's available. And also from my group, you can receive a morning bell commentary every morning at 8:45 Eastern, 7:45 Central. We do feature WASDE recap videos the day after the WASDE that's released monthly. The QR code will lead you to a sign up, and also you can simply type CRS text, all one word, to 833-612-0869. Also want you to have access to this. This is a free resource available to all of you. It is Successful Habits in Farming Today. It is online learning class that you can take at your pace. It includes things like crop insurance. I get to speak on that. There's a section on fertilizer, building marketing plans. I encourage you to check this out at shift.adiumadvantage.com. I wanted you to know about that as well. I'll put up my contact information. I just want to also close this out by saying thank you so much. And I really have spent a fair amount of time on the farm with Farm Credit Mid-America. If that is ever a desire to find out maybe different ways to manage risk between your crop insurance and then also the sales that you make, maybe the inputs that you make, feel free to reach out or talk to your crop insurance agent. Farm Credit does an excellent job bringing the resources of that organization and helping guide you through and help you manage risk. And I really appreciate the time this morning. I'm going to pass it along to Eric in the interest of time. Thank you very much.
I think we have technology working for a Monday morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Eric Johnson. I am a crop insurance specialist with Farm Credit, and I serve an area in Northeast Indiana. First, I want to say thanks to Steve and Brian. Appreciate those guys being part of this call this morning. It's amazing as an agent from my standpoint, knowing that we have resources and relationships, partners like Steve and Brian to support us. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you guys this morning. So my piece of the puzzle here, I want to, for those of you that may be unfamiliar with this, I want to dig into margin protection crop insurance policy briefly this morning, just to set a foundation for you. Carrying through with the theme from this morning, obviously there's no shortage of variability and uncertainty in the markets, and with the reality of profit margins tightening on the farm, margin protection is another tool for the toolbox that may help and protect you differently than other policies that have been available. Margin protection is a relatively new product that's been available in Indiana and Ohio for a couple years now. Unfortunately, it is not available in Kentucky and Tennessee at the moment. Hopefully, with the increase in demand and obviously that volatility not going away, it's something that can become available to those producers in the near future. But right now, in Farm Credit's marketplace, it's just available in Indiana and Ohio. So now I want to dig into a little bit how it could work for you. I know this next graphic is a little bit busy, but I really want to focus at first at the top of the slide, that simple equation, price times yield minus cost equals margin. And that simple equation really is a foundation for what helps keep you and your operation successful. And it's also the foundation for what how margin protection works as well. So when we think about comparing margin protection with other insurance products that you may be more familiar with, like revenue protection, county plans, GRIP and ARP, and the bands of coverage like SCO and ECO, those policies operate on revenue, and they only use part of this equation. They set a price and have a yield component, and that determines, depending on your coverage level, what the gross revenue that policy is going to protect for you. One of the fundamental differences between those policies and margin protection is that it doesn't take into consideration how much it costs you to produce that crop. So margin protection not only uses a price and a yield component, but it brings in a set of inputs that are converted into a per acre cost depending on the yield level in that county. and those costs are subtracted from that price and yield, leaving us essentially a profit margin that policy is designed to protect. Next, I just want to briefly jump into a history of general crop insurance products that have been available over the years and how margin protection came to be. So first of all, years ago, we had yield protection only, protected against the loss of bushels. And it was effective. As guys had a short crop, it protected them. But what it didn't protect was fluctuations in the market and changing grain prices. So along came revenue type policies, like we think of revenue protection, SCO and ECO bans, and other county plans. Those policies brought in not only protection against the loss of bushels, but protection against fluctuations in the market. They're highly effective. They've been used for several years now, and they make up a majority of the crop insurance products that are sold today. But once again, there's one component that's missing with all of the uncertainty and volatility, and that's not only the ability to protect against bushels or price, but also the cost of production. Next, I just want to go through a couple key details about margin protection. Again, we mentioned that it does, in fact, protect against the loss in bushels, but it does offer coverage levels up to 95%, and it is a county-based policy. So it does utilize the same RMA county projected and harvest yields as other policies we know, like SCO and ECO, as far as the yield component goes. Margin protection does include a protection factor, and it ranges from 0.8 to 1.2, and basically in layman's terms, this is a claim multiplier. So for instance, if a margin protection policy triggered a claim of $100 an acre for a producer, and he had a protection factor selected of 1.2, it would pay him $120 an acre on a $100 claim. Next, a significant difference between other policies we're familiar with. Margin protection does have a sales closing deadline of September 30th for the following crop year. So for 2023 to have a margin protection policy in place, needs to be signed up for by September 30th of this fall, 2022. And then a couple more key differences being in the price discovery components of margin protection. So the base, or think of the spring grain price, with margin protection, that's actually being discovered right now, August 15th to September 14th. Excuse me. And because margin protection also brings in a set of input costs, those input prices, the initial discovery period for those, is also being discovered right now as well. On that second round of price discovery, the harvest prices, the grain side lines back up with other policies. The harvest price is discovered next October for the fall, same as your revenue protection and other policies. On the input cost side, majority of those are actually, that second round is discovered in April, next spring. And I'm going to show this graphic once again just to help visualize some of those differences in the cost and price discovery periods. So over here on the left, you see the price discovery, that initial projected price for the grain is being discovered right now. Next fall, we'll come back and we'll capture the harvest price, similar to the other policies we're familiar with. On the input cost side, again, those projected costs were actually in discovery for those, that set of input costs right now, discovering that initial input cost. And then we come back. Again, there's a couple different dates here, but a majority of those top three are discovered next April for the next crop year. An interesting thing to note, and one of the reasons why I really like this policy, if we think about this projected input price discovery, it lines up with generally when some producers are starting to think about locking things in or pricing inputs for next year. Typically when we think of those inputs being the cheapest that they'll be for that year. And then we come back next spring and we capture a couple of these input costs on the harvest side. Again, when growers are thinking about going to the field, we've got those inputs locked in. And generally we think about some of these inputs being the most expensive that they'll be for next crop year during that period of time. So I really think that the price and the cost discovery periods for margin protection are geared in the grower's favor. Couple reasons why we really like margin protection here at Farm Credit. I'm going to mention it again. It's 95% coverage, really high coverage, shallow deductible, and it's subsidized highly like other crop insurance products that we're familiar with. I've got on here a put option for 2023. Now I know comparing crop insurance and the options markets are not comparing apples to apples, but when we think about mitigating risk and setting a floor on a crop, think about what margin protection is doing right now and setting that projected grain price right now for next year. We're removing some of that downside risk for next year already. And we don't have delivery requirements. There's no positions to sell out of, no broker fees. We're just trying to set a floor and minimize risk early with this policy. Again, it was mentioned multiple times here this morning from Steve and Brian, just volatile and uncertainty in the markets, not only the grain, but also the input side. And again, having this policy in place can help protect you against that fluctuation and variation in input prices. The next one there mentions premium credit, and I'm not going to dig into the weeds too much with this because it does vary by county, but at a high level, the way that margin protection is structured, it can be combined with an individual revenue protection policy. And because there is some inherent overlap in those coverages, margin protection actually offers a credit on that revenue protection policy. In a lot of cases, making it pretty cheap, even in some counties, almost free. So a really good deal there to combine not only individual coverage, but also the county-based margin protection coverage as well. Lastly, again, it's been mentioned this morning, but from 2021 into 2022, and now looking ahead to 2023, we're seeing some of the largest gross revenue and also net positions that we've ever seen on farms. And with tightening margins, we've never seen opportunities like this to be able to protect and establish coverage levels with crop insurance. It's pretty exciting. The last couple slides that I have, I want to just dig into a couple real world examples so that you can see how margin protection is working for you in the real world. What I'm looking at here is actually just a screenshot of an exclusive analysis tool that me and my counterparts here at Farm Credit have access to. One of the exciting things that I find about working with Farm Credit and being able to serve the growers that Farm Credit serves is Farm Credit's made a tremendous effort into providing us with state-of-the-art decision and analysis tools that we can come to the growers and say, look, let us help you make the most informed decision for how to protect your risk. So want to look at an example. What I've got here is 2021. This is for corn, and I'm looking at Huntington County, Indiana. Well, we know what happened in 2021, and for the most part in my area, we had tremendous yields. In some cases, there were record yields on farms in 2021. When we look at the next couple arrows here, we're looking at the projected price versus the harvest price for a margin protection policy in 2021. Again, we know what happened in 2021, and there was a pretty significant increase from the projected to the harvest price. So over $1.50 increase in the market price for corn on the policy. So not only did we have tremendous yields, but we had a pretty significant increase in price. When we jump down to the bottom, we do see that, hey, there was a slight increase in input costs per acre. Those costs per acre did increase about 13.5%. So won't go unnoticed. But when we jump over here to the bottom right, we see that the policy for 2021 with the yield level, the increase in price, it was protecting a margin of $657. However, the slight increase in input costs wasn't enough to push it over and trigger a claim with this policy. In fact, it was $161 away from triggering a claim because of the yield level and increase in price in the grain price. But I want to compare it to ECO at 95%. ECO is another county product with 95% coverage available, but it does differ from margin protection because it does not take into consideration any type of cost. So the ECO 95 product, it was still over $200 away from triggering a claim. So roughly $50 an acre difference between margin protection and ECO. Margin protection would have triggered over $50 an acre sooner, or in that market, it was almost 10 bushels of more protection with margin protection. Now I want to jump to 2022. Same exact scenario, but I'm bringing in 2022 numbers in Huntington County, Indiana. So we don't know what's going to happen yet with the yield. We heard Steve talking a little bit about the Pro Farmer Tour and some expectations that are out there right now. I think it's safe to say that we're not going to be quite as high as we were in 2021, but there's a corn crop. And so I'm going to stick with, for the sake of this example, I'm going to stick with the expected yield in Huntington County, 191 bushel average across that county. And then I also want to look, so we don't know what the harvest price is going to be yet. That'll come here in October. But if the policy was finalized today, we would see very similar to 2021, a pretty significant increase from the projected price to the harvest price, over $1.50 difference there. So unsure about the yield right now, but we know we're fairly certain that there's going to be an increase in the harvest grain price. But here's one of the big kickers compared to last year. Significantly higher inputs through the course of this year than in 2021. And so we come over to the bottom right again with an estimated yield number and an increase in the grain price. In 2022, this policy is protecting over $800 of margin for the grower. And with a significant increase in input costs, for 2022, if it was finalized today with all of the variables, it would actually trigger a $47 claim. Again, I want to go back and compare that to ECO at 95% with, again, unsure exactly where yields are going to fall, but fairly certain that the harvest price is going to be significantly higher. ECO at 95% is still over $60 away from triggering a claim. So when we think about margin protection this year, taking into consideration that cost piece and actually having a positive indemnity of $47 versus ECO at 95% still being $60 away, that's almost $110 an acre more protection with margin protection versus ECO 95. And again, in today's market, that's 16, 17 bushels more of protection with margin protection. So I know I really threw a lot at you here as far as margin protection goes. A lot of details. I really encourage you to reach out if there's interest in learning more. I know that there's going to be an opportunity to type in some questions here, I think, for Micah to get to, and we can help answer those. But reach out to your local farm credit crop insurance specialist. I work with a great team of individuals. We have access to the best tools and resources in the industry to help you make informed decisions and analyze what your options are. So I think my part here is done, and I'm going to turn this back over to Micah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Eric, Steve, and Brian. We really appreciate your insight. At this time, you all are more than welcome to chat in any questions that we have. Steve, Brian, and Eric will stay on the line here for just a little while longer. For those of you that are going to drop off, thank you so much for joining us. This is a recorded webinar and will be published to our website at e-farmcredit.com in the coming days. And so if you'd like to revisit any of this information or get connected with any of these speakers, we're happy to do so. So with that, hope you all have a great week, and thank you for joining.